Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. So in a previous video, I promised that I would read an excerpt from Andy Ngo's Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. And tonight, I'm going to deliver on that promise by reading most of, but not in its entirety, the Afterword, which is where you will find the story of Andy Ngo's parents and their flight from Vietnam to the United States. In my review of the book, link is in this video's description, I explained that as much as I loved the book, the best part of the book was the story of Andy Ngo's parents, was the story of the boat people. And I find this to be an absolutely compelling and harrowing story. And the reason I'm doing this video is really because I want to see this be made into a movie. I think this is the movie, the script for the movie writes itself, and it's going to be difficult for anybody to screw this up. And unfortunately, the only movie house, because of the nature of the origin of the story and the political nature of the origin of the story, the only movie house that's going to have any hope of actually agreeing to make this movie and to produce this movie is the Daily Wire. So this isn't a plug for the Daily Wire or for Ben Shapiro, but guys, if you guys want to actually see this movie be made as much as I do after you hear this read, then you got to share this video. I've never asked for you guys to subscribe. I don't ask for you guys to like these videos. I'm not like that. That's not why I do these videos. But if you actually want to see this be made into a movie, and I do, then I got to ask for help from the audience here. I got to ask that you guys help me by sharing this video, because that's the only way it's going to make its rounds to Ben Shapiro for this decision to be made to actually make the movie. I will acknowledge that there was a movie made in 1982 called The Boat People that was about the refugees that were fleeing Vietnam. That movie was released again in 1982, so there might be some incompleteness to that story. I haven't seen the movie. I'll have to go watch that movie, and then I'll give you guys a review of the movie in another video. But for what it's worth, the story of the boat people as told through the lens of the flight of Andy Ngo's parents, to me, is such a good story that I don't care how good that movie was from 1982. I want to see it be made today, and I think this is where this is going to start. So before we get started, there's just two pieces of housekeeping I have to go over. One is that Andy does include pictures of his parents at the beginning of the chapter. I don't know if I'll actually include them in this video through editing, but I'll consider that, and if it seems like it's something that's going to help with understanding the story, I'll include those pictures. And two, I don't speak any Vietnamese, so I apologize sincerely if I mispronounce any of the Vietnamese names and geographical locations and words throughout the course of this read, and especially at the beginning of this read, that I'm going to wind up butchering. So apologies in advance to all of that. So without further ado, let's dive into tonight's read in the Afterword. In 1979, a young Vietnamese couple arrived in the United States as asylum seekers. Though both originated from the same province in southeastern Vietnam, they actually met each other during their 6-month stay at a camp run by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, near Tanjung Pinang, Indonesia. A few years prior, their union would have been unusual and seen as a mini-scandal. Mai, the woman, came from a middle-class nouveau-riche family who owned a jewelry business in Vung Tau, a beach town popular with tourists from Saigon. Bin, on the other hand, was born into a poor family in Long Dinh, a small town near Vung Tau. His father, a Hakka immigrant from southern China, died when he was a child. Before the fall of Saigon in 1975, the two would likely not have met. Their origins and upbringing placed them at different social strata. As a girl, Mai excelled academically. She loved history, literature, and music. She was trained to play the mandolin. She learned English. Her older brother was one of the few Vietnamese students granted the opportunity to study at university in France. Mai herself was preparing to be of the early generation of Vietnamese young women to go to university. In contrast, Bin was educated to only around 15 years old. he needed to enter the workforce as a teen to help support his single mother, nieces, and nephews. While their origins and upbringing placed them at opposite ends of South Vietnamese society, Mai and Bin would soon know destitution together. By the early 1970s, the United States reduced the number of American troops in Vietnam, leading to a withdrawal by 1973 under President Richard Nixon. Though not suffering large defeats, morale was devastatingly low among the Americans as the war dragged on and on. At that time, it was America's longest war. Nearly 50,000 American troops were killed in action, and countless others were suffering from debilitating injuries, PTSD, and drug addiction. Ongoing anti-Vietnam War protests and negative press coverage at home, coupled with the Nixon administration's scandals, shifted U.S. priorities elsewhere. Without continued massive American military support, the South Vietnamese Army was unable to hold off the assault by the People's Army of Vietnam, along with their guerrilla communist forces in the South. On April 29, 1975, the communists rolled into Saigon, the South's capital, with tanks. They captured key locations with ease. In those final hours, only the most well-connected and fortunate elites had the means to evacuate on the few remaining helicopters. Everyone else could only watch or listen by radio. The uncertainty and chaos ended quickly. By the following day, the presidential palace, South Vietnam's equivalent to the White House, was captured. The three-striped yellow and red flag of South Vietnam was taken down, never to be flown again in the country. After nearly 20 years, the war was over. It was a humiliating defeat for the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Americans. The world's strongest military could not overpower the forces of a developing Asian country, aided by the vastly inferior militaries of China and the Soviet Union. The few Vietnamese who fled or immigrated before April 1975 were lucky. What began next was the process of reunification under communist rule. And the victors had plans for the counter-revolutionaries. Prison camps. In the months after the fall of Saigon in 1975, hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese were ordered to register for mandatory quote-unquote re-education, euphemistically named by the new government. Those targeted were led to believe the classes would last mere days. The detainees were actually sent to prison camps in remote regions of the country as punishment for quote-unquote counter-revolutionary behavior and quote-unquote collaborating with the enemy, the United States. Detention periods lasted months at their shortest and up to 17 years for some. The communist government targeted those who were accused of having any affiliation with the former South Vietnamese regime. This included government employees and all military people, but also expanded to include religious leaders and the middle class. Bin, then 21, was swept up in the dragnet. Though he only served as a rookie police officer assigned to desk duties in Baria, the Vietnamese government targeted law enforcement linked to the former regime. Bin spent the next year laboring in the jungle fields of Bao Lam, a rural commune in the southeast of the country. They were forced to farm crops they never got to eat. Prisoners were underfed or starved and housed in conditions that exposed them to weather, disease, and pests. Bin recalls how he and the other prisoners had their skin ravaged from chronic exposure to fleas and mosquitoes. There was no medical aid, turning small cuts and bites into vectors for infection. In 1982, human rights activists Janetta Sagan and Stephen Denny from the Indochina Center of the University of California, Berkeley, attempted to shed light on the plight of the Vietnamese political prisoners, which was largely unknown in the West. Quote, "Re-education as it has been implemented in Vietnam is both a means of revenge and a sophisticated technique of repression and indoctrination, which developed for several years in the North and was extended to the South following the 1975 communist takeover," end quote, they wrote. Indeed, forced suffering and misery were the function of the camps. Prisoners were dehumanized as punishment for being so-called counter-revolutionaries. Those caught attempting to escape were shot and killed. The few who successfully escaped the borders of the camp found themselves lost in the middle of a jungle, forcing them to return to the prison they'd fled. Another subcategory of prisoners was the middle and upper classes who owned commercial enterprises. Their businesses, which often doubled as their homes, were confiscated without compensation. Mai, her parents, and all the siblings, ranging from young adults to young children, were sent to prison camp for this reason. The family owned a jewelry business, a product of hard work within a generation, rather than through inheritance or nobility. But it was of no difference to the government. It was argued that the family's wealth was acquired through the exploitation of workers. The family's savings, possessions, and home were seized in a raid. Mai's eldest brother, Sen, was sent to a prison camp in North Vietnam for his work with the South Vietnamese intelligence services. No one knew where he was exactly, or whether he was even alive. The rest of the siblings, including Mai, were sent to a converted prison camp near their former home. Age provided no mercy. Young children were punished along with their parents. Mai was 16 at the time and still vividly remembers the rats running on the ground where they slept. Worse yet, the camp was infested with fire ants. On one occasion, Mai woke up with a burning sensation within her head. Fire ants had crawled into her ear canal. She cried from the pain. Mai's mother was helpless. A fellow prisoner suggested pouring water in Mai's ear to see if the ants could be agitated out. Dean, the youngest sibling in the family at 10 years old, suffered from infected skin rashes on his groin. There was nothing to clean or treat the wounds, which had developed into open pustules. On another occasion, Mai woke up with a sharp piercing pain in her toe. It was bleeding. Quote, "That's a rat bite," end quote, one of her brothers said. The bite became infected and her foot swelled up, making each step painful. She was still required to perform the daily task of transporting water from the well using buckets. The family languished in the camp for the next 14 months. Relatives were too afraid to visit, fearing they would also be imprisoned. Only poor family friends with nothing to lose braved the journey. One time they brought sugar byproducts as a treat for the children. The camp served the prisoners salted gruel made from boiling spoiled rice grains. In addition to the hard labor, there were interrogations, with particular attention focused on the young. Quote, "Tell us where your parents hid the jewelry and we'll let you leave," end quote, camp officials told Mai and her siblings. They believed the family hid jewels and gold beyond what had been confiscated. In addition to forced labor in the camps, prisoners were subject to intense indoctrination. Day in and day out, they had to read and repeat communist texts. They were required to confess their alleged quote-unquote sins against the Vietnamese people. The more depraved one could portray oneself, regardless of truth, the better the confession would be received by camp leaders. The goal of the indoctrination classes was to break the will, spirit, and individuality of prisoners so that they could be reformed into quote-unquote proper socialist citizens. Boat people. From the late 1970s all the way through the 1980s, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled the Socialist Republic on cramped, unseaworthy boats to nearby countries that didn't want them. Untold numbers of people perished at sea. The UNHCR estimated that up to 400,000 died fleeing Indochina on boats. But death wasn't necessarily the worst fate, according to some survivors. The Gulf of Thailand was infested with pirates who specifically targeted refugee boats. In addition to being robbed, the females were gang raped, and survivors would sometimes be abducted if they weren't killed. The dangers were no secret to families who contemplated leaving, but to them, the risk was worth taking. Even after destitute prisoners were released from camps, they faced continual state-sanctioned persecution through extended probation periods where they were surveilled, could not leave the country, and could not send their children to school. The mismanaged socialist economy also brought about food shortages throughout the country, something South Vietnamese had not previously experienced. Those on probation were not allowed to receive government food rations. If one expressed dissident views during the probation period, they could be sent back to prison camp. Faced with such oppressive conditions, hundreds of thousands chose to risk death by fleeing on derelict boats. These refugees became known as boat people. By 1979, conditions became dire enough that Bin, Mai, and their families made arrangements to abandon everything for a last escape. Mai had already attempted and failed to leave on 3 previous occasions. Bad weather or broken equipment forced the boats to return to shore. Quote, "I told my sister that if this time were to fail again, I'd give up," end quote, she says. Bin's family borrowed money from extended relatives to finance this trip. It cost an average of $3,000 paid in 24-karat gold bars at the time, for the exit papers and travel cost. Adjusted to 2020, that is more than $11,000, an astronomical amount for those in a developing country at the time. Mai and Bin, who did not know each other, were cramped with dozens of others in a small boat that departed from the southern coast of the country. The boat headed toward Malaysia, a 5-day trip at sea. Belongings of value were confiscated or stolen at refugee camps, leading refugees to creatively sew thin jewelry bracelets in the seams of their clothing. Mai's family chose to hide what few diamonds they had left in the cruelest and most desperate of ways. Her parents had a dentist extract teeth from both her and her younger brother to hide diamonds. Each sacrificed tooth housed one tiny diamond. With the uncertainty of where the children would ultimately settle, Mai's parents were desperate to ensure that they had something of value to pawn off. After days at sea in cramped conditions, where seasick passengers vomited on each other, they arrived in Malaysia. But the Indochinese refugee crisis had stretched neighboring countries and their camps to a breaking point. After several weeks of moving the new arrivals from camp to camp, the Malaysian authorities forced them back out to sea, this time on boats that were damaged and flooding. The intention was to make it a one-way trip. They shot at the boats when they attempted to turn back toward Malaysia. The only choice was to continue onward to neighboring Indonesia. After a day and a half, they finally arrived at the Riau Islands, where there was an established UNHCR camp. It was here that Bin and Mai met and began a relationship that turned into romance. Mai, now a 19-year-old woman, was attracted to Bin's kindness. Every morning, those running the camp dumped a large batch of freshly caught fish on the ground for a first-come, first-served scramble among the refugees. Aggressive men usually made off with the best fish, leaving the undesired sardines and bait as leftovers for the rest. Bin sought to impress Mai by jousting with the other men for the best fish to give to her. He also helped her fetch water from the well, a laborious task involving travel using buckets attached to a carrying pole. In turn, she would lend him her oil stove and cooking pot, items she purchased by pawning off her small bits of jewelry. After the next half year, they continued to bond on the island. When it was determined that both would be settled in the United States, where they had distant relatives, they made tentative plans to continue their relationship in their future home. Land of the Free. From 1975 to 1997, the UNHCR estimates that more than 800,000 Vietnamese refugees were housed in camps throughout Southeast Asia and Hong Kong. The majority were boat people. The United States, Australia, and Canada welcomed the majority of them, with a smaller number settling in Western Europe. Before the 1970s, There was no history of Vietnamese migration to the West. Today, they form the fourth largest Asian American ethnic group in the United States. By the end of 1979, Mai and Bin were on flights toward the west coast of the United States, with layovers in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. Bin was settled in Portland, Oregon, while Mai was sent to San Francisco. The following year, they wed in San Francisco's Chinatown district. Shortly after, Mai moved up to Portland to live with her husband. Life in a new country with an unfamiliar culture and language was difficult, but they cherished the new freedoms they had: freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Quote, "America is number one," end quote, Mai would always say. Bin worked at an assembly line in a factory where he befriended other Asian immigrants. The work was hard manual labor, and English was not a required skill. Mai took a position as a vegetable washer in the kitchen of a downtown hotel. At night, they took English classes. Together, they earned a meager income. It was enough to rent a small apartment that was shared with another Vietnamese family. They were homesick for their family and friends, whom they had no way of contacting, and they missed the food. There weren't any Vietnamese or Asian supermarkets in Portland in the early 1980s. Initially, it was particularly difficult for Mai to adopt the taste of American cuisine, though over time she acquired a liking of spaghetti with bolognese sauce. The United States continued to resettle tens of thousands of Vietnamese refugees all the way into the early 1990s. The diaspora communities established quote-unquote Little Saigon areas across the United States, like in San Jose and Orange County, California. Well, I hope you guys liked that as much as that story as much as I did, or were at least as intrigued by that story as much as I did. We're not going to finish the afterword because the afterword gets back into the story and away from this, back into the heart of Unmasked and away from the story of Andy's parents, which I hope will one day make it onto the silver screen, or at least onto the digital version of the silver screen. So, folks, again, last time I'm going to make this appeal. If you want to see this story be made into a movie, if you like this read as much as I did, remember to share this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Good night.